Good morning, church. I'm glad to be with you today. I want to tell you that Florence, Alabama is my home. First United Methodist Church is my church. You're my family, and I thank you for loving me. Today, I want to talk about Moses. I want to talk about the Old Testament in general and Moses in particular. I love the Old Testament. I love the great stories and the big personalities of the Old Testament, but most of our sermons come from the New Testament, and I think that's true for most churches. Now, here at First United Methodist Church, we follow the Common Lectionary, Revised Common Lectionary, which offers us 4 texts every Sunday to choose from. And Dale and I usually use one of these texts that's offered for the basis of our sermons. There'll be an Old Testament passage, a psalm, a gospel passage, and an epistle passage. And I picked the Old Testament passage for today. All of these readings, though, center around our calendar, around Easter and Christmas, and it all centers on the life of Christ. But it gives us every 3 years an organized way to reflect on all of our core beliefs and our core values. In the book of Ephesians chapter 4, we're told to mature in Christ, to mature in our faith, and to become like Jesus. And the lessons that we learn from all of the Bible and the Old Testament can help us mature in our faith, to help us grow spiritually, and to become more like Christ. Most of the personalities of the Old Testament are associated with major themes. With Abraham, we study faith. With David, we have the Psalms. With Solomon, we have the Proverbs. With Job, we study suffering. With Ezra, the temple is rebuilt. Jeremiah and Isaiah are books of prophecy. But what do you think of when you think of Moses? So much of the Old Testament is devoted to the story of Moses. What about the birth of Moses? When Moses was born, the Jewish babies were in peril from the existing government. And so his mother hid him in a basket. His sister watched him. They placed him in weeds by the river, in the reeds, and he was found by Pharaoh's daughter. She took him home, adopted him. He was raised in her house and became a prince in Pharaoh's castle. What about the call of Moses? After he left Pharaoh's house, he was working as a shepherd. He saw a bush that was on fire and it didn't burn up. And in that bush, he heard a call of God calling him to take his people out of Egypt and take them to the land that was promised. What about the 10 plagues? The blood, the locusts, the flies, the frogs, the hail, the darkness, all culminating in the Passover, the death of the firstborn. Or maybe it was the parting of the Red Sea when Moses held out his staff and the waters parted. Maybe it was the 40 years they wandered in the wilderness. Maybe it was Moses not being able to go into the promised land. We read all these fabulous stories about Moses in the Old Testament. But none of these great events compare to Moses receiving the 10 commandments from God that Dean just read a while ago. On Mount Sinai, these 10 commandments are the moral principles for our human civilization. And these principles are found in all civilizations, in all cultures. Do you know the 10 commandments? I think most of us know 3 or 4 or 7 or 8 or maybe all of them. But look in your handout in the order of worship for today, and let's look at the 10 commandments. You can recite these with me if you want to. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. You shall remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Honor your father and mother. You shall not kill. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not lie. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife. You shall not covet your neighbor's things. Now, these commandments have not changed for hundreds and thousands of years because human nature has not changed for thousands of years. Even with all the change in governments and civilizations, knowledge and medicine, science, technology, the birth of new nations, human nature has not changed. We still serve various false gods. We still curse and swear and dishonor God's name. Many times we don't have time to worship. We kill and we steal and we want other people's property. So we still need the 10 Commandments. Every century, every generation, every society applies these 10 Commandments to their situation. in their particular time. And even in the Bible, we find slight differences in the Ten Commandments as written in Exodus 20, Leviticus 19, and Deuteronomy 5. So every generation needs to look at these commandments and apply them to where we are right now. So let's look at this and see how they might apply in our situations. The first commandment is, thou shalt have no other gods before me. Now, in Old Testament times, normally they had household gods or gods that they traveled with, and they were little 10 or 12-inch wooden statues that they were made out of wood, and that was their idols. Now, we probably don't have any statues or idols in our houses. You may have figurines. In my house, I've got a Parian figurine of Napoleon and various other biblical characters, but they're not idols. They're not worship. But we do worship other things. We worship money, clothes, houses, cars, even people we worship. Martin Luther said that our God is anything that we fear, love, and trust above all things. Well, the second commandment is, you shall not take the name of the Lord in vain. That is, we should not curse, swear, or disrespect God's name. And we see it all the time. In sporting events, in books and movies, on television, we hear the name of God and Jesus abused. And we're not just talking about what we call in Alabama cuss words. We're talking about disrespecting God and the English language. The third commandment, remember the Lord's day and keep it holy. And they tell exactly what then that meant. On the Sabbath day, they were not to work their donkeys, their oxen, their servants. They were not to work themselves on that seventh day, the Sabbath. Now, I don't think any of us have any donkeys. I know we don't have any oxen. We don't have any servants. And we normally don't work on Sunday. Sometimes we have to. Some of you have to. But what we see in this commandment is the importance of rest, of community worship, and focusing on God and His Word. And that applies to us today. The fourth commandment, honor your father and mother. Counselors and psychologists and psychiatrists all agree that an important part of good mental health is healing fractures and reconciling differences in our families. It's really important. And now that people are living longer in our mobile society, when my parents or your parents or my sister or your sister or our kids may live 2,000 miles from us, sometimes it takes inventive means to honor, respect, and help our parents, our siblings, our family. The fifth commandment, you shall not murder. 4 words, thou shalt not murder. And this sounds so simple, but it too is complicated, because consider warfare, consider capital punishment, abortion issues. There was a battle in the Civil War in the 1860s when 54,000 men were killed in one day. And now we have the potential with modern weapons to kill thousands or millions of people in a moment. The United States has more murderers in prison than any other country in the world. And we think we live in a civilized country. The sixth commandment, you should not commit adultery. This too is complicated with birth control and a lack of commitment to our relationships, sexually stimulating advertising. But commitment to our relationships is so important, all of our relationships. The seventh commandment, you should not steal. Stealing is just taking advantage of somebody. We may think stealing is stealing a car or embezzling from the office. But stealing is shoplifting. Stealing is not helping someone who needs help. Stealing is not meeting a godly need that you see that exists and you withhold your money from that. The eighth commandment, you should not bear false witness. When we go back to the seventh commandment, thou shalt not steal, we also are not to steal the good name of someone or the good name of God. When we don't bear false witness, it's not just lying. It's telling personal, private information about someone that shouldn't be shared. It's gossiping. It may be spreading false rumors. It may be spreading unsubstantiated information about someone that we don't need to share. The ninth commandment, you should not covet your neighbor's wife. And again, this is complicated when men and women work together and we live in a mobile society And it's a temptation we always have to be guarded against. In the 10th commandment, you should not covet anything of your neighbor's. Don't covet anything your neighbor has. Don't covet their cars or their jewelry or their homes, their clothes, their boat, their lifestyle. Don't make it a burden that you covet what somebody else has. Every generation, every culture needs to freshly apply these 10 commandments to their own situation, their daily lives. And it's not easy sometimes. In the New Testament, how did Jesus handle all of these laws? In the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the books we call the law, there's over 600 commandments, laws that were to be kept. Jesus at times seems to ignore many or most of these laws. And we read in the New Testament how Jesus will say, "You have read, or you may have heard, but I tell you this." For instance, Jesus said, "You have read, or you have heard, do not murder. But I tell you, don't hate someone." And he goes on with other things like that. In fact, Jesus said the entire Bible can be summarized in 2 commandments. Jesus quotes from Deuteronomy 5 when he says, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind." That's the first and greatest commandment. Then he quoted from Leviticus 19:18 when he says, the second commandment is love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus said, so loving God with all you have and loving your neighbor, you do this and you'll find life. You'll find a rich life and you'll find a happy life. We still need the 10 commandments because we're still attracted to other gods. We're not careful enough with our language. We lust for what other people have that's theirs and it's not ours. We still gossip and we ignore good things that we could be doing and we could be supporting. So we still need the 10 commandments. So I invite you to read, meditate on the 10 commandments, pray about the 10 commandments, and apply them to our lives.